столько людей, что ли, было проведено. Потом 2030 год.
Типичный средний рост.
А потом...
Okay, here come the answers. So, 7 billion people on the planet. 25% of them make an average salary of $12,000 a year. Was the average salary for 25%. Bit of a difficult one, that one. 28 is the average age of a typical man, Han Chinese male. 28 is the average age. There are 9 million of them. 9 million 28-year-old male Han Chinese. However, this will all change in the year 2030, where they'll all come from India. The average height of a typical man in Peru is 5 feet 4.5 inches. As opposed to the person from Holland, where I think it was, I can't remember. The age of a woman in Afghanistan, the life expectancy, 45 years old. Yeah? So the average age, yeah? In Afghanistan. And 8 was the number of hours you need to collect water in Ethiopia. So it's a long day. Interesting task, because with students I would play the video maybe 2 or 3 times. But think about what's going on. You are reading, you're writing, and then afterwards you're speaking and listening to each other. So it's integrating all 4 skills so that you build up the answers. If you're preparing students for university, it's also important because they're learning the skills of note-taking as well. And they're building that up as well. So I think it's a particularly useful task. It's quite difficult. You can increase or decrease the level of difficulty by increasing or decreasing the number of numbers they have to look for, essentially. If you would like to do that exercise with some students tomorrow or later in the week, if you're doing a lesson on facts, figures, numbers, that type of language, it's a nice one to do. Go to my blog that I gave you earlier, EL Teacher Trainer. Click on video. There's a tab at the top called video, and you'll find a description of the video and how to use it in class and different ways of using it, okay? You'll find it there somewhere. But on the National Geographic videos, they have quite a lot of informational videos like this now. They're making a lot of them, and I think it's quite interesting to use them with students because they're developing reading skills that they may need in the future. It's very different from reading it off a page. So I think it's very representative of the type of reading that our students do. So I'm going to finish up this session just to sum up what I said earlier. Reading in the future, authentic context-rich texts that are culturally diverse. Think about how we can develop students' critical thinking skills, and how can you integrate reading into the other 3 skills, speaking, listening, writing, and also integrating it into other visual media, using video in the class and so on. I'm going to stop there for about 2 minutes while I set up to talk about grammar. I think it's particularly interesting that they've left grammar to the end. That wouldn't have been my suggestion. It's like having the grammar lesson on Friday at 4 o'clock with your students, isn't it? But if you're interested, I'm going to do some sort of grammar activities involving imagination. So if you want to stay around for that, feel free. If you have to go, it's fine. But let's take a short break. Thank you. So, imaginative grammar. We're going to have about 30 to 40 minutes looking at some grammar activities. I chose the title Imaginative Grammar because I spent a time writing 3 levels of grammar called practical grammar. Let me warn you, if you want to go mad, write 3 levels of grammar. mentally it's incredibly difficult, particularly when you get up to this level. This is the level 3, and the challenge is big. But anyway, so we wrote 3 levels of practical grammar, and the books are essentially the opposite in a way of imaginative grammar. They are quite simply, if you open any spread in the book, any unit, you will see a context. The title here, defining relative clauses. So we get a context, then you get a section which is the presentation that explains the grammar, then you get a practice section with gap fill exercises, control practice exercises. And that's all it is. It doesn't try to be a course book, it's for self-study essentially. So it's for the students either to use at home. However, I do meet teachers who use it in class for extra practice with grammar and so on. And when they use it in class, of course, it only takes you from the presentation stage to the practice stage. But the bit that I'm interested in this session is this white space here. Because it's the bit that's not in the book. It's the bit where you suddenly say to the students, now I want you to imagine something and do something creative with the grammar. So it's the creative stage. And in terms of classroom teaching, it's one of the hardest stage, because you can present the grammar, you can practice it, but then you have to kind of let the students go and try out the grammar. And it's the difficult bit. Now it's interesting because when we ask students to imagine something, it's actually quite difficult, but we do it all the time. I listened to teachers teaching and I wrote down when they asked students to imagine, or I looked in course books. We do it in lots of ways. Here are some examples that I've heard in the class. Imagine you're a person in this reading. Imagine you're people in the listening. How many times have you asked students to write a story and imagine something? We do it a lot, particularly if we've taught the past simple, for example. Now imagine something and write about it. Imagine you live in the house in the photograph. Imagine if you won $1 million. That old favourite for second conditional, yeah? Everybody's used that example, yeah? Students, have you been asked that one?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Imagine you work in a call centre, answer your partner's telephone call from a business English class. We ask students to imagine all the time, and yet it's quite difficult for some students. If I say to you, imagine something, it's not an easy task to do. We need to help students to imagine. We need to give them building blocks. They can't do it just without some help. But often when teachers say, my students have no imagination, what they really mean is, I haven't prepared them properly to imagine things because they need help. It's not that they don't have imagination. You're okay, students, you have imagination, but we need to help you. The teachers need to help you. And I want to look at the way we help students to imagine. First of all, students need, if we use pictures to help students imagine, or we choose a context to help students imagine, it has to be an interesting context. If I want to teach the possessive have, I could choose this context, but for me personally, I think it's a bit boring because it's all I'm going to get is, I have a sister. Well, it's not that interesting really. Yeah, I have a sister, I have 2 brothers, but is it interesting? I don't know. It's not an interesting imaginative context. However, if I took this picture and looked at what he has, suddenly it's a bit more interesting because it's based on a real context, and suddenly we're interested in to know what the dream is. Here's an activity I often use with students when I've been teaching comparative forms, particularly in business English classrooms. I might have presented the comparative form, done some control practice. I put the students into groups and I say, imagine you all work for a company that produces this clock. You only produce one type of clock, and so you're losing money. You need to produce more types of clocks. So I put them into groups and they have to brainstorm new types of clocks to produce. They have to come up with all sorts of different types of clocks to start selling on the market to become more profitable. If I ask students to do that on its own, a lot of them will struggle because I haven't given them anything to imagine with. It's quite difficult for some students to suddenly start thinking about this. If I give them prompts for the free practice stage, then they'll start to work. So I might suggest to them, make it larger, make it smaller, make it simpler, make it more complicated, more frequent, more colourful, more appealing and easier, or more exclusive. And now suddenly I've given them the building blocks. It also means they're likely to use the comparative forms as well, because I'm feeding in a little bit of the language. I don't just drop them in cold, it makes a big difference. So they need time and they need guidance and learner training to be able to use the imagination. Now, if we want to know more about imagination, there's an interesting person who can tell us quite a bit. Einstein had a lot to say about imagination. He wrote quite a bit about it, which is interesting because Einstein is mainly connected with science and fact and knowledge. But Einstein said imagination is more important than that knowledge, because for Einstein, once you had the knowledge, you needed to apply it and experiment it and be creative with it. So I think we should learn from Einstein when we talk about grammar and say imagination is more important than grammar. But nobody's going to disagree with me in the room, are you? Really? So we give the students the basic grammar, and then we say, now use your imagination and experiment with the grammar. But when I was reading about Einstein and imagination, what was more interesting than Einstein was Einstein's teacher. Because Einstein was a very bad student at school. When he was 10 or 11, he was quite a poor student, and he got into a lot of trouble with his teachers. But he had a very talented maths teacher, which is lucky for all of us, who got him interested in maths and science. And this teacher wanted to get Einstein interested in algebra, because like the rest of us, Einstein said, if A equals 10, then why do I need to talk about A? Why can't I just talk about 10? Algebra is nonsense because you use all these letters and things, but when you could just use the numbers. So he got quite frustrated. And Einstein's math teacher wanted to get the young Einstein interested in algebra, and so he said to Einstein, algebra is all about a hunt for a creature called X, and when you catch it, it has to tell you its name. And suddenly Einstein became much more interested because algebra suddenly became alive for him. He was having to use his imagination and think about things in a very different way. And it's an interesting thought to think that when Einstein came up with E equals mc squared, he actually had this picture of a big sort of creature in the forest or something saying, I'm mc squared. And I thought, can we apply this to grammar? Can we say that grammar is all about a hunt for a creature called X? And then I started to think, in this book that I did, in 100 units, I've got titles like imperatives, can, could, may, would, will, reported speech, say, tell, ask, etc. These grammar titles that are quite abstract for students. And they don't represent what students think about the grammar. And it occurred to me one day, because a student said to me, please teacher, why is the present simple called simple? Because I learn with I, you, we, they, you get the verb, and then suddenly I have he, she, it, and I have to add s. What's the point? It's not the present simple, it's the present difficult, because I keep getting it wrong. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe we should give new names to our grammar terms, and we should be more imaginative and creative with the names of our grammar. So one technique I've started doing, partly with younger learners, but also with older learners, is to get them to come up with new names for grammar, linked with characters and adjectives. I'll give you an example. This is Bob. How does Bob feel? Bored. This is Bored Bob. Okay. What is Bored Bob's typical week like? I always get up at 7. I always start work at 9. Sometimes his week is interesting because he sometimes has a jam sandwich for lunch, but usually has cheese.